there's a lot of different things I could focus on, but based on the emails I got from Drew and then just sort of discussions, I decided to focus a lot on sort of the sort of my take on it, of networks. I've been thinking a lot about networks in general from a theoretical standpoint and an applied standpoint. And today, of the networks that I'll talk about, I'll focus primarily on the scholarly literature, just because I think that's what I'm most passionate about and I get most excited, mainly because it's a great model system, but also it's really fun to study. It's a really fun system to study. So I see, I mean, this is my sort of take on the world, but there's two ways of understanding how the world works. You can do it from the individual standpoint. I think a lot of people know kind of where I'm going here, but you can, for example, this could be a cell, and you can take that individual cell and you can prod it and break it and take it apart and do all of your work on this. And molecular biology of the 21st century has been incredibly successful with this method. It's shown how productive it is, and it's one really successful way at understanding the world. Well, there's another way to look at the world, and that's looking at those individual cells within the population. And this is sort of, this has been talked about for nearly a century, probably longer than a century. But this is the sort of way I look at the world. And when I look at the world like this, it's the interactions between these cells, or whatever the individual in the system is, that really allows me to try to understand how the world works. And when I talk about interactions, so I'll say it a lot throughout this talk, so I want to clarify what I mean by interactions. But in all systems, all biological systems, let's say, and social systems, things flow within these systems. And it's this flow that I'll talk about through the talk. You'll hear me say flow, and what I mean by that, that could be the movement of a pathogen in a human population. It could be gossip in a social media forum. But this movement can tell you a lot about the important nodes. Like you notice this node here was an important node for spreading. You can look at the communities. And really, that's looking at the flow of information or flow of stuff in big systems is what helps me answer a fundamental question that drives a lot of the sort of research I do. And it's this: how are systems organized? How can I use that flow to tell me something about how the system works? How does the structure of that system, how does it evolve over time? And how does that, just looking at the structure, tell me about the system dynamics? And in answering this question, when trying to answer this question, I see this as an exercise really in ranking and mapping. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll talk about ranking, mapping, and then I'll talk a little bit how you can use ranking and mapping to do what I call sort of navigating large data sets. And that's sort of the title of this particular talk, is data cartography. And this is what I'm really excited about. Spent a lot of time thinking about ranking, a lot of time thinking about mapping, and now it's time to put it to use. And so I'll give a few examples. I won't have a lot of time there, but because I would like to spend more time sort of telling you what I think are the important aspects of these different things. So as a biologist, my training has taught me something really important, and that is the power of a model system. Drew mentioned that I kind of use the scholarly literature as a model system, and most of everything that we know about biology comes from a small fruit fly, or C. elegans, a small worm, or this bacteria that exists in all of our gut. And that really is the sort of thing that I was trying to do when I first started thinking about networks. I wanted to find a good model system. And so fortunately for me, in the lab that I was working, we had been playing with this we'd been playing with this for a completely different question. But this idea that the scholarly literature, where the nodes are papers and the links are citations, this feature, this fact that the scholarly literature forms this vast, beautiful network, has been talked about for a long time. I mean, probably the most famous paper on this was written by DeSola Price in Science in 1965, where he talked about this feature. By looking at the scholarly literature this way, you could tell a lot about by looking at how these citations were laid down, where science has been and where it's going. And it can tell you a lot about scholarly evaluation. It's the idea that we should look at the scholarly literature is definitely not my idea. This has been talked about a long time. But the reason why I have decided to really think about this, because I talked about flow at the beginning, the first couple slides here, and I really see scholarship is all about the flow of ideas. Citations are not. This really reflects the decisions of millions of scholars over a long time. And so when if I think about scholarship as the flow of ideas, as you can expect, I would also think about networks as all about the flow of information. So when I think about networks, now some networks are not about the flow of information, and it's one thing I sort of teach when I give seminars on this or give talks, that there are different ways of representing networks represent different things. And I'm specifically talking about networks that represent flow information. So I think of this as a model system. I mean, just to give you a couple of reasons why I think it's a really good model system. One, the nodes and the links are well defined. And that's not the case with most sociology networks and biological networks. The data is now becoming more and more readily available, just even in the last 5 years, at least with the research I've done. It's becoming, I mean, I almost have all of sort of human knowledge since Newton's time sitting on my laptop, which is crazy to think that we can go through and mine that kind of data, which is really exciting. And then also a lot of the theory in network science has been done on this for decades. And then the other big thing is it's just fun. It's just fun to look at this stuff. So when I first started working on this, one of the things I always do when I jump into a new project is I want to come up with the simplest question I possibly can. So I had this model system, and I told you that I wanted to understand what are the important nodes and what are the important communities. So let's just start with a really, really simple question. This was the question I had started. This was several years ago. How do I identify important journals? These are the nodes in a journal citation network. And before I could go to sort of answer that question, I had to figure out what had been done before. So I started following my own citation trails, and I found a really important paper in 1927 by these two people, Gross and Gross. They were two chemists at Pomona College. It's a small college in California, liberal arts college. And they were starting a PhD program in chemistry, and they needed to figure out how they could put together a collection of journals in their library for a very limited amount of money. And that's a problem in all sorts of, not just with this library, but all libraries and a lot of organizations in academia. They had limited budget, and so the method they came up with is they said, who does the best journal cite? And so they just looked at the journals, they tallied all these, and then they ordered them, and they said, these are the journals we'll keep. This is the most important journal, these are who they cite. At the time, it just seemed like a really sort of unimportant paper. Well, this particular paper has had an enormous influence on the structure and form of scientific communication since then. But really, the method was counting citations. So if we fast forward 30 years, another gentleman by the name of Eugene Garfield was also asking this same question. What are the most important journals in a collection? He wasn't so worried about a collection in a library. He was looking at the frontiers of science. And so what he wanted to do was figure out, how do I choose which journals are the most important in my collection if I'm going to look at the frontiers? There's just too many journals. Even in 1955, there were too many journals. So what he came up with was a very similar way. It was counting citations, essentially. But the only difference, really, was that, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. The only difference is that citations could be from all journals, not just one journal. And you would normalize by the size of the journal. So basically divide by the number of articles. So for this journal, Journal of Biological Chemistry, let's say it got 3 citations in 2 articles over a 2-year period, you'd have an impact factor for 1.5. And for those that know about impact factor, it's completely also had a huge, huge influence on scholarly communication and scholarship in general, for better or for worse. And it's not Eugene Garfield's fault. He's actually, I've met him. He's a really nice and very smart gentleman. That wasn't what his impact factor was intended to. But the point I want to make is that it's also counting citations. So now let me get to what the most interesting part, after I'd been following lots of citation trails, learning about this field so I could try to answer this question. For nearly a century, this network property that DeSolo Price had been talking about was ignored. We were just counting citations. Big decisions are being done on impact factor and of counting citation. You know, promotion and tenure, funding, marketing, advertisements in these journals. There's just so many big decisions that are made on these, but we're ignoring this important network property. And what I claim, and I hope to explain here, is that that network, there's a lot of information in the network. That's the whole point about network science, is that if there is something useful there, let's try to extract it. So that was my goal. Here's my question. I wanted to identify important journals, but I had a caveat. I wanted to use the citation network rather than just do a counting method. So that's the sort of, what I'm going to do now is summarize in basically one slide, after doing a bunch of thinking for many years about what network science was, reading lots of theory papers, working with lots of network scientists. I'm going to summarize what I think is network science in one slide. It's not the perfect summary, but I'll just give you what I think is basically network science. So here's data from from a high school in Michigan. And all the information I'm going to give you here is that the pink nodes are female and the blue nodes are male, and these are friendships. So if I give you the sort of non-network, the sort of local version of this information, you don't know anything other than there's 2 females and they both have 4 friendships. It's not until you embed these data sets into the full network that you start to see that these two individuals marked with these black arrows they actually do play and have played when they've done this study a much different role in the spread of gossip and information in this particular social network. So the point is, when you account for the network, you get different information for these different nodes. So that's basically the whole point of network science, that there is information contained in the structure of a network. That's the whole point of network science, and that was the point of a lot of my research, and still is a lot of the point of what I like to do, is the network matters, and I want to increase that information horizon. So how is it that I can extract that extra information? And so whether you're working in a social network, biological network, physical system, there is extra information. So I'm just going to simplify the problem really here. There's lots of different ways of identifying the important nodes in a network. There's tons of centrality measures. So I just chose one, the degree centrality, which is a non-network measure, doesn't take into account the network, and an eigenvector centrality. So I'll just compare those real quickly. So degree centrality is essentially just counting the links in the node. So this is the same network that you were looking at, the high school network, and all I've done here is strip the nodes out of the network. So in this case, there is a male, believe it or not, that has 9 friendships, and then there's a female, whatever those friendships mean, and there's females. There's one female with 5 and one female or male with 5, and then you have 4 here. And what you see with degree centrality is that these nodes start to lose their identity. They're all exactly the same by a non-network measure, and so we can't distinguish between those. So that's the point. It's not until we move to a more, it seems like a lot more complicated mathematics, but I'm going to explain it. Instead of sort of walking through the mathematics in this, I found it much more effective to actually show you how the algorithm works. So I'm going to go real quick to here. So what I want to show you is how, because I've talked about degree centrality. Here's one way of getting important nodes. And a lot of the work that me and my colleagues have done have been on building algorithms and mathematics that extract this extra information. So if I've convinced you that this extra information is useful, now let's see a couple ways on how to extract it. So I had some mathematics. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to walk you through how the algorithm works. So pretend this is a journal citation network again. So the nodes could be journals, and the links are citations. The thicker the line, the more citations going between there. And at this scale, you can start to get an idea what the important nodes are. I mean, so it's, maybe you wouldn't need a fancy algorithm or any mathematics, but most of the networks we deal with are much, much bigger. So let's just see if we can even do it at this scale. So what I want you to do is just, before I tell you the answer, find which one would you think is the most important node in this particular network. Just kind of get an idea. I mean, you can make guesses. Keep it sort of in your mind, because humans are really good at sort of partitioning these sorts of patterns. So it's something you can kind of get an idea, but sometimes the results are surprising. So there's 2 ways I'm going to try to explain how the algorithm works. One of them is to pretend that you go to the library and randomly start walking around, picking up a journal in the library, and you randomly choose a citation in that particular journal, and then you follow you go to that journal, and you go to and follow a citation, then go to another rack in the library, and then you keep following random citations all around the library, and you keep track of where you are. And this is very similar to sort of PageRank. There are some differences in the mathematics, but it's essentially this random walk. So let's just. What are the colors? So the colors don't mean anything yet until I get to the mapping. Okay. So good question. So keep that in mind, because when I talk about the mapping, that will actually be really important. So OK, so let's just seed this random walker. So let's start. So oops, stop. Stop. OK, so you saw the random walker walking around this network. And what the random walker's doing is it's going to, right here, it's here, and now it has a choice. It can go here, here, here. So it flips a 3-sided coin. And what this is telling you right here is it's keeping track of the percentage of time at each one of these nodes. It's hit 3 nodes. And I only show up to 12%, but this would be 33%, 33%, 33%. So this is just keeping track of where the random walker is going. Does that make sense to everyone? So let's let the random walker keep going through. So step. I'll just actually start it up and let the random walker go. So if you let this random walker go for a very, very long time in the library, what you'll find is that it doesn't matter where you start or how you seed the random walker, it'll always converge to these gray bars. So if I let this go a very long time, these gray bars are going to fill up, and they're going to be they're going to like map onto what we call a stationary distribution. And this is one way of capturing this extra information, because if I only counted citations, like I showed you with degree centrality, many of these would have exactly the same. So that's the random walker interpretation. But here's what's cool. You can actually think of it in terms of a deterministic iterative voting interpretation as well. So if I reset it, and now, so that was a way of interpreting it with a random walker. Now here's another way. I'm basically going through the mathematics without going through the mathematics. So, whoops, let's initialize vote. So now what we're going to do is do a little different game. Instead of a random walker, each individual is going to give one vote. And that one vote can be distributed based, you distribute your vote based on how many citations. So this node right here, when I say go, it's going to distribute its voting, like what it's accumulated in terms of voting, to these two nodes. And everyone's going to do that at the same time. So if we watch, if I turn it down really slow, and you watch this particular node, just keep your kind of eye on this particular node. Oh, by the way, these correspond, so you can kind of get an idea. Well, you see which one's important already. But let's just vote. And you see how it's distributing. And we vote again. And we just do this procedure over and over and over. It's iterative. So we do this over and over and over and over again. And in doing that, if you let this go a very long time, it converges to the exact same thing. This is really cool. From a mathematical standpoint, it's really cool to get a stochastic interpretation be equivalent to a deterministic iterative explanation. So the point is, the two things I just showed you are basically the mathematics behind that algorithm that I showed you. And those are different ways of thinking about it. So when I say
all those blue dots are people that know one another and came from the same lab.
Sorry, OK, so let's go back to, OK, so yes?
So they're actually citing one another.
Oh, like self-citations and stuff? Yeah, so we look at that. So this is sort of a general way of getting information from a network, but when we apply it to the scholarly literature, self-citation and stuff like that is an important issue if you really want to identify the important ones.
I was talking about, your friend who graduated 5 years ago. But anyway,
Yeah.
So many things influencing citation.
Oh yeah, there's so many, exactly. And so when I talk about it being a good model system, it still doesn't mean it's messy. So it's very messy, and actually, like the way when I first published the first thing about this, I decided that whole issue, at least with self-citation, was messy, so I just eliminated self-citations. But there are lots of different things. That's why network stuff's so cool, because there's unlimited questions. You can start to see, well, how is this going? And so yeah, so it's good.
So
okay.
Before you go on,
yeah.
That give me the idea. So does this sort of simulation give you a null hypothesis for non-biased networking that you would use to test a question like that?
So I think one way of also stating it is, can you find out if it actually gives you good information? Does it give you good signal? Does what the answer should be?
Well, if you have a topology and you go through a simulation like that, and it gives you sort of an expectation for whatever an unbiased behavior of that or construction of that network would be, could you then compare it to a real one and ask if that real network really deviates from that?
Yeah, so that's what's great is that's what's so fun about the scholarly literature is we have a pretty good intuition of what at least the answer is when we run it. And so I mean, by the way, we never run it as a simulation. It's a simple calculation that you do within the computer. It does it and it runs it. But we have done lots and lots of verification. Fortunately, I've worked with people that have done a lot of that work for me. Not for me, but they've done that work. And I can show some examples, but they do, and it does. It doesn't map perfectly because a network, by the way, is still an oversimplification. It's adding more information, but this random walk, being able to do what's using Markov theory to extract this extra information is a simplification too. So it'll never map perfectly unless you look at the full pass. And actually, we're working on a paper right now that looks at full pass, and it's really hard. It's really, really hard. So. Okay, so I kind of showed you a little bit, at least how it works. First thing people want to say is, oh, how is it different in the scholarly literature when you compare to something like impact factor? You can't really see, it's being cut off just a little bit here. But I just chose economics because economics is really interesting because economists complain and have complained for a long time about the faultiness of impact factor. And the one example that they almost all give is the...
For people in the room that don't understand impact factor now, when you evaluate a associate professors and so forth, they have to put the impact factor associated
With the journal that they publish in, yeah.
Publish in on every single publication. It influences promotion and tenure at most places.
Yeah, and it's
That's why
unfortunate.
a lot of people criticize it. It's
Yeah.
used a lot.
Yeah, and it's misused. And so, for example, one of the big misuses is they say, well, what's the impact factor of, so they tally the impact factor of the journals, and actually within an individual journal there's big variation. And so most, like for example, Nature gets 80% of its citation strength in the impact factor calculation from 20% of its papers, the 80-20 rule sort of thing. They've actually even reported that. So in that case, just because your paper was published doesn't mean it's worse or better, or it just doesn't give you any information. Anyway, so it's unfortunately a little bit too emphasized. But the point is, economists complain and they say, well, a lot of the health economic journals, how can they possibly be better than the American Economic Review? They're like, this is ridiculous. And of course it is, when you talk to most economists in the field. And that's because of the way the citation cultures are crossing over into life sciences, which have higher citation rates. And I'm not going to get into this. But the point is, when you do it by a centrality, eigenvector centrality, which I call eigenfactor here, this drops all the way down here. So there is some corrections. Now again, it's not perfect. I mean, most of the intuition, basically I can say with one statement, because there's been a lot of work into this, the extracting through eigenvector centrality maps much better to the intuitions of people in the field. But it's not just in the scholarly literature that we do this. I mean, the most famous example of all this is Google. They use an eigenvector centrality approach called PageRank, and it's been the most successful application of Markov theory of anything ever known. And although most people would agree that that was pretty successful too. So I built a site a long time ago and calculated on a bunch of journals and kind of and decided to just give these tools away for free to scholars and anyone who wants to use them. And then from there, a whole project started. And so when we say eigenfactor project, yeah, there is the rankings, and people actually they use them it's kind of become an industry standard. And but it's the project now that's grown from that I'm most excited about and proud of. There's all sorts of other questions, of course, that you can use the metrics for. Like I mentioned, librarians are using this from all over the world to try to figure out how to deal with their collections. We talk to publishers and help them understand their content. Aggregators, governments. I work with a lot of different government agencies on ways in which they can use this. And one of the main commercial players in the business of information metrics, Thomson Reuters, that moves quite slow, decided after a long evaluation, or actually not too long of evaluation, they now include the eigenfactor metrics in their products, which was through a long data agreement between the University of Washington and Thomson. There's all sorts of different ways that the metrics are used. I'm just going to show you a couple. I told you that publishers use it. Here's one way that the publishers use it. I like to pull out interesting stories, so that's the one I chose. But what you're looking at here, publishers always come to us and say, we're going to start a new policy. Like, for example, there was a publisher not so long ago in biology that said, we're going to do one thing. We're going to improve this. We're going to decrease the time it takes for postdoc papers to get through the peer review process. And people are like, oh, that's a funny sort of little thing to do. And that one, ever since then, it's correlative, but I think it's also the cause for this huge improvement. This particular journal has taken off and is really, really important now just because of that. And so they look at this information over time. So I'm going to do another example here where all you're looking at here is basically this eigenvector centrality measure. This is our eigenfactor score sort of thing. This is the total number of articles. The size is the eigenfactor. So in a best case world, things move in this direction. But all you need to know here is that the circles are journals. Okay? And there's two publishers I've listed. There's Cell, which is one of the premier publishers in the area of molecular and cell biology. And then, of course, Nature. Nature is yellow and green. The only difference between green and yellow is this. Yellow circles from the same publisher have the word nature in it. The green ones don't have the word nature in it. So let's see what happens over time since 1997. Kind of watch over here. Here comes the yellow journal. Oh, there's some more yellow journals. All the yellow. Oh, here's some more yellow. Oh, more yellow journals. More. And see this whole thing here. Actually, I haven't updated it yet because I need to update the last 3 or 4 years. But this comes in. So basically, branding in science actually matters, which is crazy. We think we're scientists and we do just because it turns out this is a lesson that I learned about sort of scientific communication. Here's another example. This was recent. I just released this a couple months ago. This is cost effectiveness for open access journals. So the problem, first of all, I'm very much sort of watching this experiment going on in open access, and I do think that's kind of where publishing is going. But the problem is there's a lot of predatory journals. There was an article just written today in the New York Times talking about predatory journals. I was so happy to see that. The problem is the predatory journals are there to say, hey, send your article. We'll charge you a lot of money. So this is price. That's value. So this journal right here. So basically, I should say what I did. So I went and collected all this pricing information, scraped it off the internet, and then incorporated it with the metric to make it so that the prices and value are more transparent. Surprisingly, that tool hasn't been out there. So I thought, well, why don't I should put that out there? And the main thing is that I want this market to be cleaned up a little bit. So here's this journal, $4,000 to publish it, yet it doesn't have a very good article influence value at all compared to the rest of the field. But the idea is if you were to choose, let's say this is the journal you always publish in. I'll just choose one here. Breeding science. Let's say you publish in this, and of course you want to do this by field, but the idea is, here are the boxes that you should care about. This box, it's more expensive and you get less value. Don't put it here. In fact, I was going to color this red, but my university said I was going to get sued if I did that. So red, and sort of green. Here's the green section, because these are cheaper journals, and you can see all the free journals here. There are a lot of no-fee journals. And more value. These other boxes just depend on how much money you have in your lab. If you want to pay more, you'll get more. If you want to pay less, you'll at least, it works more with what are called indifference curves. But the idea is, here's another way of building on top of metrics. I can give you tons and tons of examples. That's how I want scholars to be able to use this. This is how sometimes researchers use this. So we have lots of. My colleagues and I, we've built lots of different ways of visualizing this flow of information. So what you're looking at here is the journals are the little squares here, and the outside are the fields. And you're looking at the flow of information between different journals. So if I click on, this is Nature. So if I click on Nature, this is, obviously Nature is very well connected through the whole field. Or you can collect on entire fields, like we can collect on mathematics, for example. And you can look at how mathematics is connected to a lot of the different fields. But I'm going to show you one example that I'm going to say later in the talk, which is kind of cool. I got to find it, though. Journal of Finance. That's what I want to see. So a colleague came up to me one time. I was at a conference. And the Journal of Finance is a very insular field. Financial people work on very financial data. And I had a sort of colleague come up to me and say, what in the world is this going on? This was in 2006. This is Journal of Finance. And so I'll tell you what happened a little later in the talk. So I want you to keep that in mind. Because I went to start playing around with it, and then we got a call from something. So I'll show you what happens here. So let me just, so here are some examples I'll show. There's lots of different examples. Showed this. But I want to sort of remind you of the original question, which was how to identify important journals. And so my colleagues and I, we've done a bunch of work on how to basically extract the important nodes in a network. And what we found is that as soon as that question was not fully answered, but we'd start to make progress, this is the next question that started to get asked. I'm a geographer. I don't really care about the best nodes in the full system. I want to know the best geography journals. And so this is a general question in networks. How do you identify the relevant communities in these? And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the next section, which is what I call mapping. Another way of thinking about it is clustering or community detection, which is a big field. But when I think of mapping, this is the way I think about it, it is ranking. It's what I just talked about, but it's ranking with context. And so that's the next section on mapping. So, and one thing I should say about mapping and ranking, this paper I'm working on right now with one of my colleagues in Sweden, we're realizing that you can't talk about community detection without talking about ranking. And you can't really talk about ranking unless you talk about community detection. A little bit of this issue about who is citing who and things like that. So far I kind of told you here sort of this. I'm interested in systems. I take the sort of systems approach to science. I told you that these things are really quite important for telling you about system organization. They can tell you about the importance of nodes. And now I'm going to talk about how you identify the communities within these by looking at citations. So this is a whole talk in and of itself, so I'm really sort of compressing this in a very, very short number of slides. But basically, this is work that had built off the Eigenfactor project through Martin Roswell and Carl Bergstrom, who were in my lab as a PhD and also, sort of forever collaborators. So we just have a lot of fun. But the basic philosophy behind when I'm saying mapping is it's this duality that exists between compressing information and finding patterns. It's all sort of built off of MDL statistics, which I think is a fascinating area. But it's really about, when I talk about mapping, I'm talking about simplifying and highlighting the relevant structures, the relevant communities in a large data set. So here's another way of thinking about it. So if here's the ice sculpture outside of Umye, I can't say it ever, University. And what I've done is taken this image and split it up so that these two images are both 5.8 megabytes in size. And what I'm trying to do is explain this duality between compression and finding patterns. So if I take these images, they're exactly the same size, they're TIFF images, uncompressed. If I use some just basic LZW lossless compression, I can get this particular image down to 0.9 megabytes. This image I can't get as far, I get down to 2.8 megabytes. So does anyone see why I can compress this a lot more than I can compress this one? Stuff, yeah, there's less features, there's less patterns. And so this is one way that I can demonstrate. There's a lot of different ways, but the point that I'm trying to make with this is that when you compress data, when you compress systems, it tells you a lot about patterns. So that kind of resulted in the work. It's called the map equation. Again, like I said, this was originally sort of worked out in our lab, and we've been building ever since. Right now, Martin and I are working on a paper that looks at the map equation, but looks at higher order information. So there's all sorts of things. I unfortunately don't have time to go through the mathematics and the simulation here, but the idea is if I have time, I will go back and it'll explain how you detect the green, how you find the green. Whoops, okay, that's right here. I can tell it'll explain that. So if I have time, remind me and I will go back and I'll explain it. But I want to kind of keep on schedule so we have time for questions and get through this other stuff too. So I showed this network. This at this scale again, finding patterns is not so difficult. It's not until you start to scale up. And this was the first data set that I dealt with. This, at the time, seemed very big, but I look back at this sort of longingly, oh, that was such a nice small data set. Now, I mean, we're really, it's exciting. We're working with data sets many orders of magnitude bigger than this. But the point is, I just want to say, what happens when you scale with it? And try to map these sorts of things without compressing. If you outcompress, this is sort of what you get, and this is a real map. It's a big mess. You've got to compress to look at the important features. And by the way, I'm only showing 10% of the network here. I'm only showing 800 nodes. And some nodes are so small that you only see the titles. But you can start to see Science, the journal Science down in here, and the links are the citations. You see American Sociological Review up in here. Econometrica, one of the best sort of economic journals. But this really taught me a lesson about big data in general. So it's sort of one of the things I market myself now as a lot of people are, is I'm a data scientist, and I like this sort of data-driven approach of science right now. But what this taught me is that big data isn't about how much data we collect. It doesn't make us any smarter the more data we put in our hard drives or whatever. It's much more about the filtering and the removing and the compressing so that we can move from a picture like this to a picture like this. So this is the first map that we created with this technique that we call sort of infomap and map equation. And what this represents, it's the same 8,000 journals and 10 million citations. But what it's doing now is it's compressing to the most important features, which in this, if you're at this, just like zooming in and zooming out of a map, at different scales you'll have more features. At this scale, you're seeing fields instead of individual journals. But inside this, the field of molecular and cell biology are thousands of journals. And this represents the size of the node, represents the flow that's moving, the citation flow within the field. The outer ring represents the flow outside. And the links, the bigger the link and the darker the link, represents citation flow. So as you can see, there's a strong connection, as you would imagine, between medicine, molecular and cell biology. Here's the backbone with physics. You see sort of computer science and telecommunications, the social sciences, economics, psychology, sociology, those little different areas. And so this is when it starts to get useful. And also, if I had more time, I was going to ask, we have an interactive version where you can play around with this map and see, we could pick a field and we can go around and see what it's connected to. We can zoom in and out, but I'll have to wait till afterwards as well. So I want to get to a couple challenges in mapping. So I jumped through mapping really fast, but I just thought it would be more interesting to talk about some of the challenges that we've run across in mapping. One of the most exciting things about mapping is, at least with networks, is doing this across time. And so let me give you an example at a smaller scale. So not long ago, several months ago, the Chronicle of Higher Education came to us and said they were writing a paper about neuroeconomics. And neuroeconomics is this field where neuroscientists and economists get together, they grab a subject and they throw it in an MRI, and then they see what happens to the brain activity after playing certain economic games, like Prisoner's Dilemma or anything like that. And they were going to write a story saying this seems to be an emerging field. Do you have any evidence of this in your citation literature? So what we found, so what I did is I went and extracted all citations from just economics and all of them from neuroscience. I looked in 1997, and here's what I found. And this represents literally tens of thousands. In fact, I think it was around 400,000 between 400,000 citations, a ton of citations. And there was zero. That's really surprising, actually, because I've looked at other fields and looked at the formation of other fields, and there was zero citations in 1997. When I fast forwarded to 2010, we start to see the formation of what could be a standalone field of neuroeconomics. And the thing is that economists think that this is great because if we look at if we look at how the brain behaves, that'll help us understand the economic models they play with. Neuroscientists are excited because they're thinking, well, if we can look at how people behave, maybe that tells us something about brain function. So they're hoping that that's, well, it looks like they're at least talking at this point, and it might be forming. And I told you that I was going to tell you what sort of what this led to. This was funny because this was a sort of observation that someone else had. They said, look at this, and okay, this is cool. And then it wasn't until several years later, the Chronicle of Higher Education, because maybe it's just building, the field is in the formation field, that they were writing a paper about this, and they wanted to see if there was evidence. So anyway, the point is, it looks like there is evidence, and this is so much fun, I think, when we start to see the formation of a new field. So that was at that scale. But what happens when you look at all of science, and you look at 2 data points here? It's very difficult to see what the differences are between these 2 data points. I mean, if you look really carefully, you see a lot of structural changes going on in sort of the life sciences. Of course, that was 1995 in telecommunications and computer science, big changes. But even with just 2 data points, this is 1995, and this was the map that I showed before in 2004, it's difficult to see what's different in those. And it's important because that's what's really cool about using these maps is we start to see what's changed. So you need a different way of looking at it. So one of the different ways that our lab came up with is what's called an alluvial diagram. So what you're looking at here is this is the field of molecular and cell biology, but it's represented in terms of a rectangle now. And I've only shown a couple fields here, and this is from some work that Martin had done, and here he wanted to isolate these particular fields for various reasons that I'll show you. But here's the way to look about it. So these are the groups. Don't worry about the color yet. Those are the circles you saw. It's just in a different form. So if you kind of think about this transformation, or if you're comfortable with this transformation, you start to see that you can use this as a way of looking at what's changing over time. So you start to see movement in psychology and psychiatry in different areas. You see a break off of medicine, but it's not until you play it many years ahead that you see what we think is one of the more exciting things that has happened in the last decade when we look at all these different fields forming. The standalone field of neuroscience as we know it today really happened over the last decade. And when we've talked to people, we've talked to a lot of people in the field, and this sort of confirms their sort of intuition of what's going on. There still was people thinking about, doesn't mean people weren't thinking about neuroscience, is that there were major groups in neurology, psychology, molecular and cell biology, and medicine. And now those same groups, and we can see this in the data, this is really fascinating, we can see what is now the standalone field of neuroscience. And there's different ways in using, this is one way of using an alluvial diagram. Recently, Carl was asked by the federal funds, so this one isn't mine, but I think it's a really fascinating example. And actually the citation's getting cut off here. It's a fascinating example of other ways in which you can use these alluvial diagrams. So the federal banks came to our lab and said, hey, can we use these alluvial diagrams to look at the flow of money between the major banks? So here, don't worry about all this that's going on. There's a lot going on here. But instead of journals and citations, we're now looking at monetary flow between major banks. And what they wanted to know is there a way of using this as a way of detecting systemic risk before the Lehman Brothers. So I should say that this is in 2008. This is when the Lehman Brothers fell. This is when the major economic crisis happened. And can anyone guess what this happened on October 8th without looking on Wikipedia and Google yet? So I mean, I should say that the reason why this is marked is these groups, these banks were sharing with each other. These represent hundreds of banks. They were sharing with each other, and then on this day they broke apart. And then that's a breaking apart. Now we saw just the opposite on that same day. There's another part of the network. These are two parts of the network. They were different groups sharing, and then boom, they came together as a way. Maybe that's a way of sort of comfort during these times they shared with each other. But any ideas? You can just take a guess, because I was completely wrong, by the way. So don't, when we were trying to guess. What happened on October 8th?
2008, right?
Yeah, 2008.
Political.
Okay, so very, very good. Yeah, so that's okay. You're hitting onto something. This is somewhat related, but this is fascinating because it was the first time that it's historical in some ways that Feds paid interest on reserves. So they told banks, keep the money, don't worry about it, and we'll pay you interest on it, which was quite monumental. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what caused all this, because there could be some time delay, and there's all sorts of work that that our lab's doing on this sort of thing. But this is just another example of the way in which the techniques can be used, because these things are, generally these are things that networks have properties, these network properties exist in all sorts of systems. That's the beauty of networks. So I don't have time to talk about this, but this is really exciting. We're working on this. This is the sort of jargon barriers in science. So instead of looking just at citations, we actually look at the text. And we can actually look at, I won't go into detail, but basically you can look at where some fields actually are really close together in citations, but they have huge jargon barriers. And actually that tells us a lot about scientific communication as much as the citations. And so I'm excited about this whole new area that we're moving into. So I told you I was going to mention a few things about navigating. How do you use the maps to do stuff? So I'll just give you one quick example and then some areas that my colleagues and I are working on currently right now. But when I talk about navigating in this sense, data navigating, I'm talking about how you use the mapping to traverse these knowledge landscapes. So this was a simple question, just like the simple question I started the project with, that a colleague of mine, Jennifer Jacquette at NYU, came to me, and she had a personal story about her role as a female in scholarship. And she just was curious. She knew about our mapping tools. She knew about our data set that we were amassing. She wanted to know, can you guys answer this question? I mean, how do what gender disparities still exist across academia? So I said, let's try to answer this. This wasn't too long ago. And so I went and got another new data set from JSTOR, where I got the full text of 8.2 million articles over a very long period, which is what I wanted, a long period so we could look at these changes. And then I need you to go to, of course, I scraped a bunch of data from the Social Security, which was, it was all legal, where we use this as a way of identifying gender. And I could get into more details about the study. I think it was a really fun, exciting story. Actually, we're working with Shelley Carell at Stanford, too, who's the head of the Clayman Institute of Gender Research there. And she's really excited about this data set now that we're going to hopefully build on. But here's sort of the main story. So I told this was a question she had. And as you would expect, if you just look at the percentage of women over from 1920, I've only put the window in the last 100 years because that's where I'm more confident in the data.
Women authors or
yes.
Are cited?
So yes, good question. So these are just authors that we could identify. So there was a small portion that we can't, but believe it, we spent a lot of time really raising the fidelity of that matching algorithm. And so these are just female authors in science since 1920, just total female authors.
How did you identify? Did we use the names to identify?
So that Social Security data set that we pulled 300 million names, male and female names. And then we said, James is 99.9% always a boy, so we use that as an identifier. Now there are those sort of other names, and that does give us some noise in the system. But we report that. We know that there's going to be some noise in the system when you do these sorts of studies. But this is what we found, at least on the names we could identify. And as you would expect, things are improving. This is a 30. It's still not exactly where we want it to be, but this doesn't really surprise. This looking aggregately didn't completely surprise us or any of the gender researchers we were working with. It wasn't until we started looking at first author and last author that started to get interesting. So in a lot of fields in life sciences, first author actually means something, and the last author actually means something. The last author is usually the PI, but not in all fields, and we'll see that. But if you look aggregately, if you look at the first author, it's a little bit different. The story's a little bit different. It wasn't so great, actually, because this should match up with this because this is the percentage of females. Well, if it was random mixing, you expect it to be over there. It wasn't so good, but it has improved since the 1980s. In fact, here's what's cool, is that we actually even see crossing. So there's more female authors, at least with this data set that we looked at, tiny bit more than what you'd expect given the proportion of females in the population. But it's not until we look at last authors that, again, it's looking better in some ways, and it still needs improvement in others. That you see, this is due because there's no convention. So don't worry about this, but this noise that you see in the system is that there really wasn't no last author convention. And actually, the data shows you when the convention started to click in. It was during the sort of 1970s, 80s. And then after it had established itself as an academic convention, we are seeing improvements, but you can see it's far less. So if you do it aggregately, this is an interesting story, but I told you that mapping gives you more. It allows you to zoom. It allows you to go in and out. So instead of looking at just aggregately, now with the mapping techniques, we can zoom into individual fields and the subfields of those subfields. And we can look at the percentage, the percentage of females and the percentage of males in the different fields and see which fields are doing well and which fields should probably improve a little bit. Let me just show this real quick, and then I'm going to kind of conclude here. But here's what's kind of cool. So you can zoom in. So what you're looking at here, so I just zoomed into the ecology and evolution. I can look at the percentage of females, so I can hover over. The colors aren't great here. You can actually then look at plant ecology, evolutionary ecology. You can look at all the subfields. Down here is just the author order information. It'll take a little longer to explain that, so I'll just stick with this. But here's when it starts to get interesting, because I told you that by building these maps, you can start to see more interesting stories, and the stories that I'm interested in. So if you look at a field that has more parity, like in sociology, they're doing much better when compared to most fields. You've got around that percentage that I showed you in the aggregate, 32%. But even within a field like sociology, where there's parity, you see high variance within sociology. And you find that females tend to work on, so let's just go, so stress and coping, household composition, this is with data showing. So sociology of the family. So what do men work on? Crime, tend to work on. There's obviously females work, but this is crazy. This stuff's popping out that men even today tend to work on things like crime and punishment, religion, segregation, these sorts of things. And so you see these sort of patterns pop out of there. But there are fields that actually have no convention, like economics, for example. They don't have a convention of last and first and last authors. So what we needed to see was this. I won't explain it in too much detail, but the fact is the dot, the last author percentage, lines exactly on what the percentage of females is. So that kind of was actually good evidence that that's sort of was confirming the details. But a good byproduct of this particular project is that we built as just a way of seeing what the most important papers are in these different fields, so I could get a sense of what the field was. Using some of the mapping and ranking, we can actually show the top papers in the different fields. Like if you move into macroeconomic theory, this actually shows the top fields. And this was just a byproduct of the project. And now we're building a full-scale sort of software that allows you to use this as a way of identifying the critical papers in these subfields. And a lot of our scholars, when they were looking at our gender stuff, they said, that's cool and everything, but I want to use that top papers thing. And so we kept getting bugged by it. And so now we're actually really building. So what this does is you can zoom in and out of these fields. You can look at sort of the important papers by the algorithm, and there's different ways of doing the algorithm. You can look at sort of New Keynesian models, and if you're someone like me who's interdisciplinary, you want to go in there and find out what are the key papers in New Keynesian models, and these are sort of by the algorithm. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from different people. Sometimes the data's not so off, but more often than not, it seems like it's really picking some really important papers. So that's one way of using the maps and navigating through the data. Here's some different areas in which I'm actually currently working on some stuff right now. So auto-classification is a big thing. Recommendation is a big thing that is another big thing that I'm excited about. We're working with some experiments. So here's auto-classification. I won't really want to go in this because you guys aren't so much interested in this. This is interesting from sort of computer science and information science standpoint. This is a way of improving information retrieval. So I've got some grants through Microsoft to see if we can auto-categorize their content. They have a huge problem. They have 50 million articles, and they don't have the money, or they do have a lot of money, but it's almost, you can't human curate this. You don't have enough money to human curate this and be able to take into account the changes of knowledge organization that are going on every day. So we want to find a way. So we're working with them on stuff where I'm doing some stuff with some patent scholars around the country, working on using this sort of techniques on the Wikipedia, which is really exciting because we can look at how different languages organize information differently, which is really exciting. The recommendation stuff is exciting because that's built off this paper thing, and we're doing real live experiments where we've got these recommendations that are built on the maps that we can actually see if scholars are following it, working with some groups at Harvard that are helping us, they helped us build a system where we can allow people to come in and then we see their behavior. And we're collecting tens of thousands of data points almost every 10 minutes. It's a huge amount of data because we're using these digital archives. Here's where I think you guys would be interested. I could go into detail on more of these things, but I'm working with the National Science Foundation. We just got a small grant with Julia Parrish at our university that we're trying to figure out how we map the field of biodiversity. So this is something that NSF wants to see. Okay, we implement this policy. How is it going to change? How is it having an effect? Can we use this citations and some of these mappings as one way of looking at it, one lens? We had a small grant with the National Institute of Health to look at how one particular program they implemented in 2000, how that was was there money being spent well, working with foundations on looking at how their impact into the scholarly literature. But here's what I'm really excited about, where I'm working with several researchers where we're trying to build what I think is like the coolest part of maps, which is being able to zoom in and out. I was recently in London. What's the first thing I do in London? I get there and I get my phone when we land and I start zooming in and out to figure out where the hotel is. But being able to seamlessly move in and out is one of my big goals as a researcher. Can we do this sort of thing with data in general? And of course, the scholarly literature is my real sort of love. I'd like to do it on that. But in general, can we do the same sorts of things? And I think we can. So that's this is just a reminder because I talked about a lot of stuff. Here's the sort of question I'm interested in general. Information flow in social and biological systems. How do we capture it? How do we measure it? How do we look at the sort of ways in which we can use this information? The approach I use primarily is the scholarly literature. There's lots of challenges. I didn't get so much into the challenges, but semantics are a new thing. Big data has always been a problem. InfoVis is trying to represent this information. The concerns I can get into if people want to talk about later today, but there are some concerns. When we build these tools for helping scholars navigate, are we moving them in the wrong way? And so I'm concerned about that sort of thing, and I think about it quite a bit. And then the relevance of this, I think we're in the midst of a major transition in scholarship and scholarly communication. And I think that these sorts of things might be ways of improving scholarly communication. So I started with a simple question. I went from that simple question to this, and that was all due to a whole bunch of work. This is not even enough. I need more slides to mention all the great people that have been a part of this. So that's it, and I'll take questions. And I can go to other stuff if you want me to. So.